Thank you. Welcome back to this webinar, and I think we'll just dive in back to Doreen. Doreen, tell us what has changed. Things have changed, and what does it mean? What does this change mean for board audit committees from your perspective, very briefly?
Okay, so thank you so much, Eva, for the question once again. And like I was saying before we went into the break, is anything that is going to reduce the value to the shareholders, or anything that is going to reduce the quality of service to society and to the people, is something of interest to the audit committees. So changes around technology, digitization, we're just having a chat earlier on to say now we have cars that are electric, we have cars that can drive themselves, we have technology that is helping customers to do things right in their homes, and that gives an opportunity to the wrong people to actually access people's finances, for example, in the banking sector. So there are also other emerging aspects like climate change. In Uganda, you will very well know that 2 years ago we did not have the kind of floods that we have. We did not have the kind of rising water levels that we have now. The landslides have gone up, and this is not only in Uganda. Recently, that happened to our neighbors in Rwanda, Southern Africa. We had Malawi also having a number of changes in the climate that impacted thousands of households. So all those things require the attention of the audit committee. So we manage them well as businesses, so that they do not erode the value of investments that have been put in these organizations, or better still, investments that have been done by ministries, departments, and agencies on behalf of government. So that increases and expands the mandate of the audit committees, and it implies that we have to bring in additional skill and talent. For example, of late, say 1 to 3 years ago, you find that most audit committees have members who have skill in technology. We have members on the audit committees who have good understanding on matters of environment, on matters of climate change, on matters of social aspects, things to do with inclusiveness and diversity. So what I can say in short is that these changes have increased pressure to the way that institutions are being managed, and that calls for more vigilance from the audit committees on behalf of the board, and therefore working for the good of the shareholders and people within the community and society.
Great. Thank you, Doreen. And I think that as lead, that's where we come in as lead, to help board committees, members who are members of board audit committees, to learn, relearn, and unlearn certain things. Yeah. And this is where this series of perspectives are coming from. So Samson, I want you to tell us about the public sector. What's changing? What has changed over the last two decades?
Yeah, thank you, moderator. Of course, the audit committee concept is relatively very young in the private sector, in the public sector, but we are nonetheless navigating the changes that come our way. And like I said, this alliance will be very useful to us. We take that the concept of audit committees is very mature in the private sector, and therefore it is very resourceful to ally. But along the way, of course, the first audit committees in government, just to speak especially central government, across ministries and sectors, produced in 2003 under the Public Finance and the Accountability Act. And later on, when we were having the PFM in 2015, we get additional improvements in the functionality of these audit committees. For instance, we have 16, but originally they were 8. So in the 20 years, you can say that we moved from 8 audit committees to 16 audit committees. Also, the introduction of the the position of internal auditor general under the PFM was a significant change, and this position was given the responsibility to appraise the performance of these audit committees across the public sector. And this PFM also required, for instance, that it brought on board risky management as a concept, requiring the public sector institutions to integrate risk management.
There is a question of reporting. It is no longer sufficient to sign off audited financial statements. We continue to see movement and progress with regard to integrated reporting. Lately, we've seen standards being enacted on sustainable reporting. Because the audit committee is responsible for the reporting function of the board of directors, audit committees need to make sure that they are able to discharge those reporting mandates. It is not so much lately about the history. You know, we performed well in 2022, and this is a report, we have to prove it. Investors are now requiring audit committees to sense check projections, to sense check goals and objectives, to make sure that you give visibility to investors about the future. So yes, you did well last year. What does the future look like? And how do you ensure that you respond to that? I've already talked about the issue of external audits. That's a pressure point for many audit committees, and I'm sure more discussion will happen on that. I've talked about the fusion between the work of risk committees and the work of audit committees. How do you draw the line? That's a question I have for us on this call. For many of us who sit on audit committees, how do you draw the line between your mandate and the mandate of a risk committee? And in fact, do you need to draw the line? Do you need to see how you work together with the risk committee? Because one might say that sometimes overly focusing on issues is not necessarily a bad thing. So how do you ensure that you have not just combined assurance between internal and external audit, but that you have a very close link between the second line of defense, which is risk management, and the third line of defense, which is audit? There's also the overarching mandate of the audit committee with regard to the internal control framework. How do we ensure that as an audit committee, we're able to oversee effective internal control frameworks in an environment where we don't always understand what's happening? When you look at the pace of technological advancement, we talk about AI all the time. If we did a poll and said, who really understands AI on this call, we might be surprised. But we as audit committees are required to interrogate proposals around AI, around machine learning, around robotics. How do we equip ourselves to understand those things? Because if we don't understand technology, we are going to find ourselves shortchanged with regard to internal controls. How do we respond in an environment of high volume of transactions? We're playing catch up. How do we respond in an environment where we have more discerning, impatient customers? They don't have time to fill in 5 forms. They don't have time to do 2-factor authentication. How do we ensure that we serve our customers, that the business of the companies that we oversight as audit committees does not suffer unnecessarily because of internal control challenges? How do we operate in an environment of a constrained macroeconomic factors? We're talking about inflation. We're talking about high cost of living. We're talking about people having very little money in their pockets. That's an environment that facilitates a high level of fraud, a high level of sometimes inappropriate employee activity. How do you as an audit committee ensure that the internal control framework works even when the macros around you do not work? People risks in many organizations, these sit with an HR committee. But people, as the people, I'm sure most people on the call will know, people are a critical factor of internal control environment. They are at the front line. however many controls, policies, frameworks, processes, systems an audit committee may recommend to the board for approval, at the end of the day, it is the people who have to make these controls work. So how do you ensure that you have internal controls that work even when you have an environment of heightened risk in terms of people? So audit committees must concern themselves with the people risks. You should not leave them to an HR committee which looks at recruitment, retention, motivation, and so on. You must concern yourself with how you use that critical risk aspect to ensure that the internal control environment works. I've talked about complexity of the environment in which we operate, but there's also complexity in systems and in how books are kept. Many of our organizations want to install high-tech, financial reporting systems, ERPs and SAPs and so on. As an audit committee, do you understand how the ERP works? Do you understand how the SAP modules that you've implemented work? It's not enough to say these reports were generated through an ERP system. As an audit committee, you need to understand how do the inputs into the system work. We all talk about junk in, junk out. As an audit committee, how do you ensure that you don't focus on the output, but you focus sufficiently on the input and who is providing the input and the quality of the input? So as we talk about perspectives of the audit committee, I would like us on the call to really think about these questions, to think about what the future means, and the future starts today for the audit committees. I know on the call I've seen some people who are audit committee chairs, I've seen board chairs, I've seen board members who sit on audit committees. How are we going to move forward? How are we going to ensure that the businesses we lead continue to do well, but that the value that our shareholders have placed in our care is not lost? And importantly, that customers do not suffer as a consequence of an audit committee not asking the right questions. Thank you very much, Eva and the rest of the team. I hope that we'll have a great discussion this evening. Thank you very much.
Chief Guest information. Sites and on all social media platforms for the League of East African Directors. So we'll continue with this discussion, and this discussion now I'd want to invite James to tell us about those external factors. We've of course, Gertrude has touched on so many of the external factors: technology advancement, the people risk, and all these other factors that are affecting audit committees. So tell us, in your view, what are those other external issues that audit committees are dealing with today?
Thank you very much, Eva, for that question. Yeah, so I'll pick it up from where I stopped. I said that, earlier I said that technology is a big thing. IT, changes in the IT environment are very, very critical for the auditor. If you look at, for example, the risk of your reputation going down because of some message going out in the social media. That becomes a big thing for us to be aware of that potential of such a thing happening. That's why, for example, it's important to, some audit committees have even made sure that there are stringent reporting mechanisms. No information should go out there to the public without properly being approved by the right persons within the organization, because any information going out there can be detrimental to your reputation. So how do you manage that? How do you make sure that those kind of incidences don't happen? We're in a country where sometimes even before you hear from the person who's supposed to speak, the speech is already available to everyone. So how do you make sure you control that? So as audit committee, we should be concerned about such things, because that can be extremely damaging to your reputation. So we should have, let's say, cybersecurity policies. We have defenses around social media, how it is done and what is communicated. Secondly, more importantly, in the external environment, we also have to continuously scan the regulatory landscape. You'll find that, especially for highly regulated industries like banks, where I happen to be in one of them, and also insurance where I serve, and even energy sector is highly regulated. You'll see that are coming up all the time, and the auditor has to be on top of this, because you need to be aware what are the changes in the regulatory environment. Bank of Uganda, for example, has been issuing a lot of guidelines, and a lot of changes coming up. So as audit committees, you need to be on top of this. You need to be scanning the environment, understanding what changes in the legislation will have an impact on your organization, and what is likely to, how should you respond to those changes within the regulatory environment. So that's another thing that as audit committees we should concern ourselves with. A change in legislation can even mean going concern problem for an organization. Your existence could be threatened if you don't respond accordingly. The other factor that's in the external environment, we've recently seen, for example, issues around globalization, because the world is now a small village. We are all living in the same kind of environment, and you'll find that something, like personally, I didn't know that, for example, most of the wheat we're getting here was coming from Ukraine until this war broke out. When these shortages started coming out, then we started seeing that actually the geopolitical factors out there also affect things within you. So you need to be scanning environment for that. Because otherwise, if you just be asleep, you could just wake up and find that everything has gone haywire. So that becomes important. And also, if you look at, for example, multinational companies, the issues around transfer pricing are very, very important. What does the audit committee scrutinize around transfer pricing? For example, if you're a multinational, you'll be expected to have a transfer pricing policy. Does your organization have a good transfer pricing policy? Has it been approved or agreed with the Uganda Revenue Authority in case of our environment? So that becomes another thing that you should really be aware of. And of course, you should be aware about what is happening in the economy. What are the exchange rates going to be like in the next 3 months, the next 6 months? How are these going to affect your particular organizations? Some organizations import a lot of equipment, especially if you're in the energy sector. If you are billing in shillings and there are changes in the exchange rate between the shilling and the dollar, it's likely to affect you. So you'll find that the audit committee now is not just concerned about financial statements, is not only concerned about governance, risk and controls, but you're also looking at the environment and scanning the environment. What could affect you out there? What is happening out there that could affect you? Something could look very remote, but at the end of the day, it could actually affect your organization. So as audit committees, we need to be alert. We need to be following the recent developments in different parts of the world, which could have a serious impact on us.
Thank you, James. I'm going to ask that we take a short break and then come back with the rest of the questions. Let's take a short break and we'll be back.